Pack your things by Friday, my daughter-in-law said, sliding a stack of papers across the dining table as if she were passing the salt. My husband had been buried for exactly 9 days. The casserole dishes from the neighbors were still stacked in my refrigerator, each one labeled in black marker with condolences that already felt distant and hollow. I sat at the head of the same oak table Richard and I had saved for 3 years to buy, the wood polished so many times over 4 decades that it reflected the chandelier above us like still water. Olivia didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words were tidy, rehearsed, almost professional. The house was in Richard's name, she continued, tapping the top page with a manicured finger. And Daniel and I have decided it's best if you move somewhere smaller. More manageable. Daniel sat beside her, his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes fixed on the legal letterhead instead of on me. My son used to look at me when he spoke. Now he looked at margins and signatures. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. The roast chicken I had insisted on cooking, because routine felt safer than grief, had gone cold between us. Friday? I asked, my voice steady enough to surprise even me. That gives me 4 days. Olivia offered a thin smile. You won't need more than that. We've already spoken to an attorney. There are options for widows in your situation. Widows in your situation. As if I were a category, a file folder, a case study. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second landing heavier than the last. Richard had installed that clock himself the summer Daniel turned 10. He'd stood on a ladder in this very room, laughing because he'd measured wrong the first time. Everything in this house held his fingerprints. The curtains I'd sewn. The baseboards he'd painted. The faint scratch on the hardwood floor from when Daniel tried to roller skate indoors at 8 years old. I looked at Olivia, really looked at her. Her black blazer was crisp, her hair pulled back with the precision of someone who had prepared for a meeting, not a family dinner. You've spoken to an attorney, I repeated. Yes, she said smoothly. We want to make sure everything is handled properly. Properly. I nodded once, as if this were a scheduling conflict instead of an eviction from the life I had built. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached for the top sheet of paper and glanced at the bolded phrases. Transfer of occupancy, restructuring of assets, temporary access limitations. Daniel finally cleared his throat. Mom, it's just practical, he said. The upkeep alone on 3,200 square feet is too much for one person. Too much for one person. I had managed this house through snowstorms that dropped 12 inches overnight, through summers when the air conditioning failed, and we slept with fans humming in every doorway, through decades of mortgage payments and property taxes that never once bounced. But I didn't say that. I stood slowly, smoothing the front of my navy cardigan, and gathered my plate. Friday, I said quietly. I'll start packing tomorrow. Olivia exhaled, relieved. Daniel nodded, grateful for my compliance. Neither of them noticed the way my hand lingered on the edge of the table, or how my eyes rested for a moment on the framed photograph near the china cabinet. Richard and me on our 40th anniversary, his arm around my shoulders, his smile certain and unafraid. They thought I was alone now. They thought grief had made me smaller. They were wrong. I began packing the next morning before the sun had fully risen, because I did not want Olivia to hear drawers opening or hangers sliding and mistake it for hesitation. The house felt different in the early light, as if it were holding its breath. I moved through the master bedroom slowly, touching each surface with deliberate care. Richard's side of the closet was still organized the way he had left it, his navy suits spaced evenly, his brown leather belt hanging from the same hook it had occupied for 20 years. I did not take his things. I only took mine. A single suitcase sat open on the bed, the same suitcase we had used for our trip to Cape Cod 5 summers ago. It looked smaller than I remembered. I folded my sweaters carefully, smoothing each one before placing it inside. Outside the window, the maple tree in the front yard swayed in the mild Connecticut breeze, its leaves just beginning to turn gold. Richard had planted that tree when Daniel graduated high school. He said it would outlive all of us. By mid-morning, I could hear Olivia moving around downstairs. Cabinet doors opened and closed with unnecessary force. A phone call drifted up the staircase, her voice low and efficient. Yes, we will need the listing photos by next week, she said. Listing photos. I paused with one of my dresses in my hands. The house had not even been discussed with me as a home. It had already become inventory. I closed my suitcase and set it by the door. Then I walked to Richard's desk in the corner of the room. The desk had deep mahogany drawers, each one lined with felt that had faded to a softer shade over the years. I opened the bottom drawer where he kept important papers. It was locked. The key was gone. For a moment I stood there, staring at the brass handle. Richard had never locked that drawer from me. Not once in 43 years of marriage. I did not knock on Olivia's office door to ask about it. Instead, I walked downstairs and poured myself a cup of coffee. Daniel was at the kitchen island, scrolling through his phone. He looked up briefly. "Morning, Mom," he said, as if we were discussing weekend plans instead of my departure. "Good morning," I replied, setting my cup on the counter. "How long has the desk been locked?" He blinked, caught off guard. "Olivia thought it would be better to keep documents organized," he said carefully. "Just until everything is settled." "Everything is settled." I nodded once. "Of course." I carried my coffee into the living room and sat in Richard's armchair. The indentation in the cushions still matched the shape of his shoulders. The television remote rested on the side table where he always left it. For a long time, I listened to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. I did not cry. Grief had already done its loudest work in the cemetery a week ago. What remained now was clarity. Around noon, a courier knocked at the front door. Olivia answered before I could stand. She signed for an envelope and carried it into the dining room. I watched from the hallway as she slid it open. Legal documents. Her expression did not change, but her posture straightened, as if she were bracing for something. "Daniel," she called. "The preliminary transfer forms are ready." Transfer. I felt the words settle into my chest like a stone. They were moving quickly. Too quickly for a situation they claimed was about practicality. I stood and walked past them without speaking, heading back upstairs. In the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the framed photograph on my nightstand. Richard's smile in that picture was steady and certain. He had always believed in preparation. Insurance policies paid on time. Taxes filed early. Wills reviewed every 5 years. He used to say, "Margaret, security is not about fear. It is about respect." I traced the edge of the frame with my fingertip. If Olivia believed she could reduce 43 years of marriage to a temporary occupancy, then she had misunderstood the man she married into this family. And perhaps she had misunderstood me as well. That afternoon, I drove to the bank without telling anyone. I did not slam the front door or announce where I was going. I simply picked up my purse, stepped into my sedan, and backed out of the driveway as calmly as I had done for years when running errands. The sky was a pale autumn blue, the kind that looks almost fragile. As I drove the familiar 5 miles into town, I passed the grocery store where Richard used to insist on choosing his own apples, squeezing each one with exaggerated seriousness, and the hardware store where he knew every clerk by name. Life outside the car moved as it always had. Inside, something had shifted. The bank lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and brewed coffee. I had been coming here for over 3 decades. The teller recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Whitmore, I am so sorry for your loss," she said gently. I thanked her and asked to speak with the branch manager about our accounts. When I was led into his office, I noticed the framed certificates on the wall and the tidy stack of folders on his desk. Order, structure, things that could be measured and confirmed. "I would like a full overview of every account in my name and my husband's name," I said, placing my purse carefully on the chair beside me. He nodded and began typing. The soft clicking of his keyboard filled the quiet room. A moment later, his expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. Cautiously, "there have been recent changes." I kept my hands folded in my lap. "What kind of changes?" He turned the monitor slightly toward me. Several accounts were marked as restricted. Access pending documentation review. Temporary holds placed 48 hours ago. The date matched the morning after the funeral. "Who authorized these holds?" I asked. He hesitated. "Your daughter-in-law submitted paperwork indicating estate restructuring. There is also a request to transfer primary oversight to your son." For a second, the room felt very still. I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward. I simply studied the screen. Richard had always insisted that I be listed as co-owner on our joint accounts. He used to say, "Margaret, paperwork is not romance, but it is protection. Are these holds permanent?" I asked. "Not yet," the manager replied. "They are preliminary. Final authorization would require documentation confirming the estate's terms." Estate's terms. I nodded slowly. And have you seen the original trust documents? He shook his head. No, ma'am. We have only received copies submitted by counsel representing your son and daughter-in-law. Copies, not originals. I felt something settle into place inside me, like the final piece of a puzzle aligning. Please print everything, I said quietly. Every change, every request, every signature. As the printer hummed beside his desk, I stared at the wall clock above his door. It was almost 2 in the afternoon. At home, Olivia was likely measuring rooms, calculating square footage, imagining fresh paint, and listing prices. She believed momentum would replace consent. She believed speed would create inevitability. When the manager handed me the stack of papers, I thanked him and placed them neatly into my purse. Mrs. Whitmore, he added gently, if you have original documentation, we strongly recommend presenting it as soon as possible. I met his eyes. I understand, I said. I walked out of the bank into the crisp air, the papers resting heavily against my side. Richard had reviewed our estate plan every 5 years without fail. He had trusted very few people, but he trusted preparation. As I unlocked my car, I realized something simple and undeniable. Olivia had moved quickly, but she had moved on assumptions. And assumptions, unlike legal documents, do not hold up under scrutiny. I did not drive straight home from the bank. Instead, I turned left at the next intersection and followed the road that curved toward the older part of town, where the brick buildings stood shoulder to shoulder and the sidewalks were narrower than the newer developments. Richard and I had walked those sidewalks many Saturday mornings when Daniel was small, stopping for coffee and pretending we were busier than we were. I parked across from a modest 2-story building with a brass plaque beside the door that read Edward Barnes, attorney at law. The letters were slightly tarnished, but still firm against the brick. Richard had introduced me to Edward more than 20 years ago, not because there was trouble, but because Richard believed in foresight. If anything ever happens to me, he had said lightly back then, his hand warm around mine, you call Edward before you call anyone else. I sat in the car for a moment, the printed bank statements resting on the passenger seat, the holds, the transfer requests, the signatures that did not include mine. My reflection in the windshield looked older than it had last month, but it did not look confused. I stepped out of the car and walked inside. The waiting area smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish. A young receptionist looked up and offered a polite smile. Do you have an appointment? She asked. No, I replied calmly. But I believe Mr. Barnes would want to see me. She disappeared down a narrow hallway and returned less than a minute later. He will see you now. Edward had more gray in his hair than I remembered, but his posture was the same. Straight. Attentive. He stood when I entered his office. Margaret, he said softly, his expression shifting into something that carried both sympathy and recognition. I am sorry about Richard. I nodded once and took the chair across from his desk. I placed the stack of bank papers in front of him without explanation. He adjusted his glasses and began reading. The room was quiet except for the faint rustle of paper turning. After several minutes, he leaned back slightly. They moved quickly, he said. Yes, I answered. They did. He folded his hands together. Did Richard ever review the trust with you personally in the past few years? I thought of the evenings at this very desk in our home, Richard spreading documents across the surface while explaining line by line what each clause meant. He never rushed those conversations. He never dismissed my questions. He did, I said. He told me everything was structured so that I would never be financially displaced. Edward nodded slowly. He was very clear about that. The house, the primary accounts, and several investment portfolios were placed into a revocable living trust with you as co-trustee. Upon his passing, you became sole acting trustee unless you voluntarily relinquished that role. I felt the words settle into my chest like steady ground. And I have not relinquished anything, I said. No, Edward replied. You have not. He turned one of the bank statements toward me and tapped the section referencing estate restructuring. What your daughter-in-law appears to be attempting is a premature asset transfer based on incomplete documentation. Copies do not override originals. Assumptions do not override filed trust instruments. I did not smile, but I felt something shift from uncertainty to clarity. What happens now? I asked. Edward opened a drawer and removed a thick folder labeled Whitmore Family Trust. The original seal was still intact. Now, he said evenly, We respond properly. He placed the folder on the desk between us. The paper inside was not loud. It did not threaten. It simply existed, precise and deliberate. Richard had prepared for this moment long before Olivia ever considered it. And for the first time since the funeral, I understood that grief had not erased my position. It had only tested whether I remembered it. When I left Edward Barnes's office, I did not feel triumphant. I felt steady. There is a difference. Triumph is loud and temporary. Steadiness is quiet and durable. The thick folder containing the original Whitmore family trust rested in my handbag, heavier than its weight in paper should have allowed. Richard had always believed that preparation was an act of love. Now I understood what he meant. I drove home at exactly the speed limit, passing the same familiar streets, the same white fences and trimmed hedges, as if nothing in the world had shifted. Yet everything had. When I pulled into the driveway, Olivia's car was parked slightly crooked, as though she had arrived in a hurry. Through the front window, I could see movement in the living room. Measuring tape extended across the hardwood floor. A notebook open on the coffee table. She was already calculating. I stepped inside quietly. Daniel looked up first. "Where did you go?" he asked, attempting casual concern. "Into town," I replied, placing my purse carefully on the entryway table. Olivia straightened, retracting the metal tape measure with a sharp click. "We were just getting an idea of space," she said lightly. "If we are going to renovate before listing, we need accurate numbers." "Listing?" She spoke as if it were inevitable. I removed my coat and hung it in the closet, the same closet where Richard used to leave his winter scarf draped over the hook. "I see," I answered. I walked into the dining room and set the trust folder on the table without opening it. Olivia's eyes flicked toward it instinctively. She recognized the weight of documents even before she knew their contents. "What is that?" she asked. "Original paperwork," I said calmly. "The kind that does not arrive by courier in a rush." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, we are only trying to handle things responsibly." I looked at him then, not with anger, but with clarity. "Responsibility requires accuracy," I said, "and accuracy requires originals." Olivia stepped closer, her expression tightening for the first time. "Our attorney has already initiated the transfer process," she replied. "It is standard procedure. Standard does not override structure," I answered evenly. I opened the folder and turned it toward them. The embossed seal from Edward's office was visible on the first page. Richard's signature sat beneath mine, dated and notarized. "Your father placed this property and the associated accounts into a revocable living trust 15 years ago," I said. "Upon his passing, I became sole acting trustee." Silence settled over the room, thick but controlled. Daniel blinked. "Sole trustee," he repeated. "Yes," I replied, "unless I choose otherwise." Olivia's composure faltered by a fraction. "That is not what our attorney indicated." "Then your attorney has incomplete information," I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply stated facts. I turned to the relevant page and slid it across the table. The language was precise. The house could not be sold, transferred, or leveraged without trustee authorization. Trustee. Singular. "The preliminary holds at the bank will be reviewed," I continued, "based on original documentation, not assumptions." Daniel sank into a chair. He looked less confident now, less certain of the path he had stepped onto. Olivia remained standing, but her shoulders were no longer squared with the same assurance. For a moment, none of us spoke. The afternoon light filtered through the dining room windows, casting long shadows across the table where Richard and I had shared countless quiet dinners. I closed the folder carefully and placed my hand on top of it. "You asked me to pack by Friday," I said softly. "I am still packing, but not because I have to." Olivia's lips parted slightly, as if preparing to argue, but no words followed. Daniel stared at the document again, reading the title as though seeing it for the first time. The house felt different now, not because the walls had changed, but because the balance had. They had moved quickly. I had moved correctly. And correctness, unlike urgency, does not unravel under pressure. The silence that followed did not explode. It tightened. Olivia was the first to move. She gathered the measuring tape from the floor and placed it deliberately on the coffee table, as if restoring order would restore control. Daniel remained seated, his hands clasped together, his eyes moving between me and the closed trust folder as though it might rearrange itself if he stared long enough. I did not reopen the document. I did not need to. The facts had already been spoken. We should call our attorney, Olivia said finally, her tone measured but strained. Of course, I replied. You should. I lifted the folder and carried it back to the dining room cabinet where Richard used to keep our most important papers. I did not lock it away. I simply placed it inside, then closed the cabinet door with steady hands. The house felt quieter now, but not fragile. There is a difference between a quiet that signals defeat and a quiet that signals recalculation. This was the latter. Daniel followed me into the kitchen a few minutes later. Mom, he began, his voice lower than usual. Why did Dad never mention this structure clearly? I poured myself a glass of water before answering. He did mention it, I said. Several times. You were usually in a hurry. Daniel looked down at the countertop. The granite still held the faint scratch from when he tried to open a soda bottle with a butter knife at 16. Some things never change. We were just trying to simplify things, he said softly. For you. I met his eyes. Simplifying does not begin with removing someone from their own home. He did not respond. Instead, he stepped back, as if unsure of where he stood. Later that evening, Olivia closed herself in the home office with her phone. I could hear the controlled cadence of her voice through the door, phrases like procedural review and unexpected clause drifting into the hallway. I did not hover. I prepared dinner as usual. Baked salmon, steamed green beans, wild rice. The routine was not submission. It was consistency. When we sat down to eat, the conversation remained practical. Weather forecasts, utility bills. No one mentioned Friday. No one mentioned packing. After dinner, I returned upstairs and opened my suitcase again. Not to add clothes, but to remove them. One by one, I placed each folded sweater back into the dresser. The act felt deliberate, not defiant. I was not unpacking out of emotion. I was restoring order. Richard's suits remained untouched on his side of the closet. I brushed my hand lightly against the fabric of one jacket, remembering how he would straighten his tie in the hallway mirror before leaving for work. He had trusted systems. He had trusted documentation. He had trusted me. Downstairs, a door closed more firmly than necessary. The house absorbed the sound without reaction. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room. The framed photograph on my nightstand caught the lamplight. 40 years of marriage distilled into a single captured smile. I did not need to raise my voice to claim my position. The trust had already done that. Olivia had believed speed would secure ownership. She had believed paperwork delivered by courier would outweigh decades of preparation. What she had not anticipated was that the foundation of this house was not simply concrete and lumber. It was documentation drafted 15 years earlier, reviewed every 5, and signed with intention. I turned off the lamp and lay down in my bed. Not a temporary bed. Not borrowed space. Mine. The clock in the hallway ticked steadily, each second measured and precise. They had asked me to pack by Friday. Friday was still coming, but it no longer belonged to them. Friday arrived with clear skies and a temperature just above 60 degrees, cool enough to justify a light sweater, but mild enough to keep the windows open. I woke before the alarm, the habit of decades guiding me into the morning without effort. For a few seconds I lay still, listening. No hurried footsteps downstairs. No drawer slamming. Only the steady ticking of the hallway clock and the distant hum of the furnace. I rose, dressed carefully, and made my bed as I always had, smoothing the comforter until not a single crease remained. Downstairs, Olivia was already at the kitchen island, her laptop open, a legal pad filled with neat columns of notes beside her. Daniel stood near the sink, staring into a coffee mug he had not yet lifted. When I entered, both of them looked up. There was an expectation in the air, like the pause before a scheduled event. I poured myself coffee and added a measured amount of cream. You have a meeting at 10, Olivia said, her tone neutral. Our attorney wants to clarify a few things. Yes, I replied. So does mine. The words settled between us without drama. At precisely 9:30, I retrieved the trust folder from the dining room cabinet. The embossed seal caught the morning light. Daniel watched me place it into my handbag, his expression unreadable. The drive to the attorney's office was quiet. Olivia insisted on riding together, as if unity could be performed through proximity. Daniel drove. I sat in the back seat, not out of submission, but because I preferred the vantage point. The law office was modern, all glass panels and brushed steel, the opposite of Edward's brick building. We were ushered into a conference room where their attorney, a man in his mid-40s with a carefully practiced smile, stood to greet us. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said politely, "we appreciate your willingness to discuss this matter efficiently." Efficiently. I placed my handbag on the table and removed the trust folder without responding. Olivia spoke first, outlining their understanding of the estate. She referenced copies previously submitted, described anticipated transfers, emphasized the practicality of consolidating assets under Daniel's oversight. The attorney nodded along. When she finished, there was a brief silence. I opened the folder and turned it toward him. "Original instrument," I said evenly. "Filed, notarized, and reviewed regularly." He adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. The room grew noticeably still. Page by page, he scanned the document. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. I was not provided with this version, he admitted after a moment. "Because you were provided with copies," I replied. "Incomplete copies." Daniel looked at Olivia. Olivia looked at the attorney. "According to this," the attorney continued slowly, "Mrs. Whitmore is the sole acting trustee upon her husband's passing. Asset liquidation or property transfer would require her authorization." I folded my hands on the table. "Correct." No one raised their voice. No one accused. The language itself did the work. "Additionally," I added, turning to a specific clause Edward had highlighted for me, "any attempt to restructure trust assets without trustee consent triggers an automatic review and temporary freeze to protect beneficiary interests." The attorney's eyes widened slightly. "That clause would indeed halt pending transfers," he confirmed. Daniel exhaled, the sound almost lost in the quiet room. Olivia's posture, once rigid with certainty, softened into something less defined. "This was not our intention," she said carefully. "Intent does not alter structure," I replied. I closed the folder gently and placed it back into my handbag. The meeting concluded not with confrontation, but with acknowledgement. Outside, the sun remained steady in the clear sky. As we walked to the parking lot, Daniel slowed his pace to walk beside me. "I did not know," he said quietly. "I know," I answered. I did not look back at the glass building. I did not need to. They had expected Friday to mark my departure. Instead, it marked clarification. And clarity, once established, does not retreat. When we returned home from the attorney's office, the house felt exactly the same and entirely different at once. The maple tree in the front yard still swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, sunlight glinting off the kitchen windows the way it had for years. Yet something invisible had shifted. Daniel unlocked the front door and stepped aside to let me enter first. It was a small gesture, almost automatic, but I noticed it. Olivia walked in behind us without speaking, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor that she had measured only 2 days earlier. I removed my coat and hung it carefully in the closet. No one mentioned packing. No one mentioned deadlines. The suitcase that had once stood by the bedroom door remained upstairs, empty now, returned to its place beneath the bed. Daniel cleared his throat in the entryway. I did not realize the structure was that specific, he said quietly. "Your father believed in specifics," I replied. "He believed in details that did not depend on mood." Olivia moved toward the kitchen, opening her laptop again as if work might restore her sense of control. But the atmosphere had changed. There was no urgency now, only recalculation. Around 4 in the afternoon, my phone rang. It was the branch manager from the bank. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said politely, "we have received verification of the original trust documentation from Mr. Barnes's office. The temporary holds initiated earlier this week have been reversed. All trustee authority remains with you." I thanked him and ended the call. I did not announce it dramatically. I simply walked into the living room where Daniel and Olivia were sitting and said, "The bank has restored full access under the trust terms." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the information. Olivia's expression tightened, not in anger, but in the quiet recognition that momentum had shifted permanently. "There was no intention to cause harm," she said carefully. "Intent does not alter outcome," I answered evenly. I sat down in Richard's armchair, feeling the familiar indentation beneath me. For a long moment, no one spoke. The house held the silence without strain. Later that evening, Daniel approached me alone in the dining room. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the oak table. I should have asked more questions, he admitted. I assumed efficiency meant progress. I looked at him with the same steady gaze I had held during the meeting. Efficiency without understanding is simply speed, I said, and speed can lead in the wrong direction. He nodded, his shoulders no longer tense, but uncertain. Upstairs, I opened the cabinet where I had placed the trust folder and ran my hand lightly across its cover. The embossed seal felt solid beneath my fingertips. Richard had prepared for circumstances he hoped would never happen. He had trusted that documentation would protect what emotion might threaten. Downstairs, I could hear Olivia speaking softly on the phone again, her tone no longer confident, but measured. Words like adjustment and review drifted faintly through the hallway. I did not listen closely. I did not need to. The automatic review clause Edward had mentioned earlier would now examine every premature transfer attempt. Nothing dramatic would occur. No raised voices. No slammed doors. Just procedural correction. I walked into the bedroom and opened the window slightly, letting the cool evening air move through the room. The curtains shifted gently, brushing against the dresser where Richard's photograph still stood. I did not feel victorious. I felt aligned. They had asked me to pack as though departure was inevitable. Instead, the process they initiated had triggered safeguards Richard designed years ago. Paper does not shout. It does not accuse. It simply holds. And once it holds correctly, it does not let go. The following Monday morning arrived without tension. The sky was overcast, a soft gray that made the house feel enclosed but calm. I woke at 6, as I always had, and walked downstairs to start the coffee. The familiar sound of the machine filling the glass pot felt grounding. I stood at the kitchen window and watched a neighbor jog past, breath visible in the cool air. Ordinary life continuing. That was the quiet truth beneath everything. Inside this house, conversations had shifted, documents had been reviewed, authority had been clarified. Outside, the world moved forward without pause. Daniel came downstairs a few minutes later. He hesitated at the edge of the kitchen as if unsure whether to enter fully. "Good morning," he said softly. "Good morning," I replied, sliding a mug toward him. He took it and leaned against the counter. For a moment we stood in silence, the steam rising between us. "I have been thinking," he began carefully. "We moved too quickly. I let practicality replace perspective. I did not rush to comfort him. Grief often disguises itself as urgency," I said. "But urgency does not always serve wisdom." He nodded, absorbing the words rather than resisting them. Olivia entered shortly after, her posture composed but subdued. She did not carry her laptop. She did not carry a legal pad. She poured herself coffee and sat at the table without speaking. The measuring tape was gone. The notebook from earlier in the week had disappeared from the coffee table. Small signs. Important signs. "We will pause any renovation plans," she said finally, her tone measured. "There is no need to discuss listing the property." I looked at her steadily. "There was never a listing," I answered. She held my gaze for a brief moment, then lowered it. The house felt settled again, not because conflict had vanished, but because boundaries had been defined. Later that afternoon, I walked through each room slowly, not as someone verifying ownership, but as someone remembering continuity. The hallway photographs remained in their frames. The hardwood floors carried the same faint scratches from decades of living. In the living room, Richard's armchair sat exactly where it had always been. I ran my hand along the back of it, feeling the worn fabric beneath my fingers. I did not need to claim this space aloud. It had already been claimed through years of intention, through signatures placed long before doubt entered the picture. That evening, Daniel approached me in the dining room once more. The light from the chandelier reflected off the oak table where the original confrontation had begun. "I do not want you to feel displaced here," he said quietly. I considered his words carefully. "Displacement begins when people forget foundations," I replied. "We have remembered them now." He nodded, a subtle acknowledgement of lessons learned. Upstairs, I opened the window again, allowing cool autumn air to move gently through the room. The maple tree outside had shed a few more leaves, scattering them across the lawn. Change does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it settles gradually, leaf by leaf. I stood by the dresser and looked at the photograph of Richard, his steady smile unchanged. "You asked me to pack?" I said softly into the quiet room, not to anyone present, but to the memory of the moment itself. I did. I had packed clarity. I had packed documentation. I had packed patience. And when Friday came, I had unpacked everything that mattered. The house did not feel like a battleground. It felt like what it had always been. Prepared, structured, steady. And so was I.